Rain fell harder as three small voices whispered from behind the cemetery oak. Thomas knelt at his wife's grave, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, when a black Mercedes pulled up. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, placed white roses beside the headstone, and stood there for a long moment before walking away. The triplets watched, confused and curious. Their father never mentioned knowing anyone like that. The stranger had tears in his eyes, too. Why would a billionaire cry at their mother's grave? If stories like this touch your heart, please subscribe to True Kindness Tales and hit that like button. We share real stories of compassion that remind us of the good in people. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when kindness changed your life. Now let me tell you what really happened that rainy afternoon, and how one chance encounter revealed a secret that would change everything. Thomas McCarthy had been a widower for 8 months. 8 months of learning how to braid his daughter Emma's hair for school. 8 months of burning grilled cheese sandwiches while his sons, Jake and Liam, did homework at the kitchen table. 8 months of sleeping on the couch because the bed felt too empty without Sarah beside him. He was a high school English teacher, and some days the only thing that got him out of bed was knowing 3 7-year-old hearts depended on him to keep going. Every Sunday, rain or shine, Thomas took the kids to visit Sarah's grave. He'd bring fresh flowers from the grocery store, usually carnations because they lasted longer and fit his tight budget. The triplets would draw pictures for their mom, folding them carefully and tucking them under stones near the headstone. Emma always drew families holding hands. Jake drew superheroes. Liam drew dinosaurs because even in grief, he was still obsessed with velociraptors. On this particular Sunday in late October, Thomas arrived to find something unusual. White roses, at least 24 of them, arranged in an elegant bouquet beside Sarah's headstone. The flowers were fresh, expensive, the kind you'd see at upscale weddings. Thomas frowned. Sarah's parents had passed years ago. He had no siblings, and neither did she. Who would leave flowers like this? He mentioned it to the cemetery groundskeeper the following week. The old man scratched his chin and said a well-dressed gentleman had been coming every Sunday for the past month, always bringing white roses, always staying just a few minutes. Thomas felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. Someone cared enough about Sarah to honor her memory, but who? The next Sunday, Thomas arrived earlier than usual. The kids were playing a car game in the back seat, arguing about whether a pterodactyl was technically a dinosaur. When that black Mercedes pulled into the cemetery, Thomas watched as a man probably in his 60s stepped out. Everything about him spoke of wealth, from his tailored coat to his polished shoes. The man walked directly to Sarah's grave and knelt down, placing another bouquet of white roses with such tender care that Thomas felt his throat tighten. Emma spotted him first and whispered, "Daddy, who's that man?" Thomas honestly didn't know. He told the kids to wait in the car and walked over just as the stranger was standing to leave. Their eyes met, and Thomas saw something he didn't expect: recognition and tears. Thomas cleared his throat and asked if they'd met before. The man's hands trembled slightly as he introduced himself as Richard Blackwell. The name meant nothing to Thomas, but Richard's next words nearly knocked him over. He said he'd been looking for Sarah for 30 years. She was his daughter. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Sarah's daughter? That was impossible. Sarah grew up in foster care. She'd told him about the loneliness of it, the constant moves, the feeling of being unwanted. She never knew her biological parents. They'd both died when she was a baby, or so she'd been told. That's what the social workers had said. That's what Sarah believed her entire life. Richard's voice broke as he explained. 30 years ago, he was a struggling businessman, drowning in debt, working 18-hour days to keep his company from failing. His wife, Margaret, was battling severe depression after a difficult pregnancy. When baby Sarah was 6 months old, Margaret's sister convinced them they couldn't give the child a proper life, that adoption would be better. In his exhausted, desperate state, Richard signed papers he'd regret for the rest of his life. Margaret never forgave herself. She took her own life 2 years later, leaving Richard alone with his guilt and grief. By the time Richard's business became successful and he had resources to search, Sarah had been lost in the foster system. Records were incomplete. Agencies closed. Years passed. He hired investigators, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, followed every lead. Nothing. Until 3 months ago, when a private detective finally tracked adoption records to a woman named Sarah McCarthy, who died in a car accident 8 months prior. Thomas listened, his own tears falling freely now. The triplets had cautiously approached and were standing beside him, sensing something important was happening. Richard looked at them, really looked at them, and his face transformed. He whispered that they had Sarah's eyes. Emma had her grandmother's chin. The resemblance was unmistakable. Thomas asked why Richard hadn't reached out, why he'd just been leaving flowers in silence. Richard's answer was simple and heartbreaking. He said he'd stolen Sarah's chance to know her real father. He'd given up that right 30 years ago. He didn't deserve to disrupt their lives, to suddenly appear claiming connection. But he couldn't stay away either. The flowers were all he'd allowed himself, a silent apology to the daughter he'd abandoned and would never be able to tell he was sorry. Something shifted in Thomas in that moment. He'd been so focused on his own grief, on being both mother and father to his children, that he'd forgotten something Sarah used to say. She'd tell him that family isn't just about blood, it's about showing up. It's about love in action. And here was a man who'd made a terrible mistake 3 decades ago, who'd spent years trying to make it right, who was showing up now even though he believed he had no right to. Thomas surprised himself by inviting Richard to dinner. The older man looked shocked, then deeply moved. He asked if Thomas was certain, and Thomas glanced at his 3 children, thought about Sarah, and said yes. The triplets, with that remarkable adaptability children have, were already asking Richard questions. Did he really know their mommy when she was a baby? Did he have pictures? Liam wanted to know if he liked dinosaurs. That dinner became a weekly tradition. Richard would arrive with groceries because he'd noticed. Thomas's fridge was mostly empty by the end of the month on a teacher's salary. He never made it obvious, never made Thomas feel like charity, just casually mentioned he'd bought too much at the store and couldn't it go to waste. He helped Jake with math homework because he'd been an engineer before business. He attended Emma's dance, recital, and cried when she dedicated her performance to her mommy in heaven and her grandpa on earth. Slowly, carefully, Richard told the triplets stories about their mother as a baby, pulling out photographs he'd kept for 3 decades. There was baby Sarah in a yellow dress, grinning with 2 tiny teeth. There was Sarah taking her first steps, arms outstretched toward a younger, hopeful Richard who thought he had time to figure everything out. The kids treasured these glimpses of the mother they'd lost, and Thomas found himself grateful for this unexpected gift. Richard never tried to replace anyone or overstep. He understood his role, but he showed up consistently, and that mattered more than anything. When the furnace broke in January, and Thomas was trying to figure out how to pay for repairs, Richard quietly hired someone to fix it. When Emma got sick with pneumonia, Richard sat in the hospital waiting room all night even though he wasn't asked. When Thomas had a breakdown one evening, overwhelmed by single parenthood and grief, Richard listened without judgment and shared his own story of survival after Margaret's death. One Sunday in spring, they all visited Sarah's grave together. Richard brought his white roses, and Thomas brought his grocery store carnations, and the kids brought new drawings. Standing there, Thomas realized that Sarah would have loved this. She'd spent her whole life believing she was unwanted, never knowing her father had been searching, had never stopped loving her. But her children would never doubt they were loved. They'd lost their mother, but they'd gained a grandfather who was learning that showing up, even late, still mattered. Thomas looked at Richard and thanked him for the flowers, for everything. Richard shook his head and said he should be thanking Thomas for giving him something he thought he'd lost forever. A family, a second chance. Thomas smiled and said that's what Sarah would have wanted. She believed in second chances. She believed in forgiveness. She believed that it's never too late to choose love. The cemetery visits continued, but they were different now. Less heavy with loneliness, warmed by connection. The triplets had their grandfather. Richard had his grandchildren. And Thomas had someone who understood loss and was learning, alongside him, how to build something beautiful from broken pieces. The white roses and grocery store carnations sat side by side, different but equally sincere, in their tribute to a woman who'd taught everyone in her life, even after she was gone, what it meant to keep your heart open. Kindness isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet persistence, like searching for 30 years. Sometimes it's vulnerable courage, like inviting a stranger into your grief. Sometimes it's forgiveness, like welcoming someone who made terrible mistakes but is trying to do better. Thomas and Richard both learned that showing up matters, that it's never too late to choose connection over isolation, and that the legacy of love Sarah left behind was stronger than any loss. If this story touched you, share it. Tell someone you care about them. Show up for people even when it's hard. Drop a comment and tell us about the unexpected, kindness that changed your perspective. Because in this world that can feel so broken, these moments of grace remind us that healing is possible, that second chances are real, and that love in the end is always worth choosing.